It was only after a marathon 9-hour meeting where Israel agreed a plan to allow aid into Gaza that the US Secretary of State announced his boss, President Biden, would come to Israel.
He's coming here at a critical moment for Israel, for the region, and for the world.
Biden's wartime visit is fraught with risk, both politically and physically. That he's decided to make the trip anyway, as the missiles rain down, is a measure of how critical Biden sees this moment. A small window to show unequivocal support for Israel, but at the same time to urge Prime Minister Netanyahu to show restraint ahead of any ground invasion into Gaza. Biden knows that with every image of buildings razed to the ground and humans suffering in Gaza, the threat of escalation from the Arab world is growing. Hence why he's ordered a massive military build-up as a deterrent, and why he issued this warning to Netanyahu on Sunday night.
Would you support Israeli occupation of Gaza at this point?
I think it'd be a big mistake. Look, what happened in Gaza, in my view, is Hamas and the extreme elements of Hamas don't represent all the Palestinian people.
It's that distinction between Hamas and ordinary citizens that Biden wants to hammer home as he simultaneously urges Netanyahu to stop blocking humanitarian aid into Gaza and allow desperate civilians, including Americans, out.
This is a really complicated matrix for the president. He wants to show solidarity with the Israelis. He's done that very well so far. As important as what he says publicly when he hits the ground in Israel will be what he says privately to the Israeli leaders and what he says to the Arab leaders he's meeting with in Jordan, who can be enormously helpful here in getting humanitarian aid in and getting hostages out.
It's a delicate negotiation. There were smiles at the UN General Assembly recently, but Biden has been critical of Netanyahu's efforts to rein in Israel's judiciary and expand settlements. But the sheer barbarity of the Hamas attack has ensured ironclad American support.
I predict what's going to happen is pretty soon we're going to have a whole bunch of people say, well, Israel's going too far. Israel is doing too much in its own defense. And I think we need to make clear right now that we're not going to buy into that line.
I think that the president's right to go, courageous and strong in his stance on Israel's right to defend itself. He stands with Israel, as do most of us.
Joe Biden walks shoulder to shoulder with our allies in the war-torn.
This was President Biden on a surprise trip to Ukraine in February, visiting an embattled Kyiv to show solidarity in the face of Russian aggression.
In the middle of a war zone, Joe Biden showed the world what America is made of.
He'll be hoping his trip to the Middle East this week portrays Biden in the same light and isn't ultimately used against him if the conflict in Israel and Gaza takes an even darker turn.
Siobhan Kennedy reporting from Washington. Well, joining me now from Rhinebeck, New York, is Richard Haass, a veteran American diplomat who's now President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Haass, it's good to have you back on the program. I wonder if I could just get your reaction to this, horrendous news from Gaza that an Israeli airstrike has killed 200 Palestinians in a hospital. This doesn't really set the stage very well for tomorrow's emergency summit, does it?
No, I think it's one of the reasons that the president is going over there, trying to thread the needle, as several others have pointed out, between Israel having the right of self-defense, having the right, indeed the duty to go after terrorists, but to do so in a way that's discriminating, essentially to try to draw a clear line between going after Hamas without hurting people who are civilians in Gaza. It's not easy. Obviously, one of Hamas's tactics is to commingle its fighters with the civilian population. But again, the president, I expect, will, as part of a larger strategy of what you might call conditional support, Matt, will press the Israelis to be as discriminating as they can.
Because in public, we've heard very little criticism of civilian casualties caused by the IDF. Do you think that in private, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and tomorrow Joe Biden will use much tougher language with the Israelis?
I don't think you use tougher language now, given what Israel's just gone through. No one should underestimate the collective trauma of what's happened in Israel. But I think it's more persuasion at this point. It's essentially smart foreign policy. That's why the United States has been pushing against the siege. That simply is not, I think, smart. It's not consistent with Israeli values. It's not going to win the hearts and minds of anybody. And I think what they should advocate for is, yes, go after Hamas, whether it's from the air or from the ground, but when you really can identify and localize Hamas. Otherwise, by the way, another thing Israel needs to do, and I hope the president pushes it, is obviously rebuild its defenses in southern and western Israel. This attack never should have been successful in the first place. Nothing like it should ever succeed again.
It's one of the challenges of this whole crisis, and indeed of tomorrow's summit, that no one really knows what should replace Hamas if indeed they're removed from the Gaza Strip. Who should run the place?
Well, it's a good question. It's one of the necessary questions. First of all, I'm not sure you can remove Hamas. Using words like eliminate, remove, root out, I think it's probably much more than military force can accomplish. I think Hamas, or something very much like it, is going to exist whenever the dust settles. In some ways, also, this type of an operation inevitably will generate more support and more recruits for it. So it's something, it's a lesson the Israelis learned in 2005. So Hamas is going to be there, or some radical organization is going to be there. The place to work with, where you have an upside, is in the West Bank. There you have a much better chance of developing what could be a Palestinian partner.
I mean, we've been talking quite a lot in the last few days about the exchanges of artillery with Hezbollah on the northern border of Israel. Iran has been rattling his saber. The Iranian foreign minister said that everyone's on the trigger here. How worried are you that this could genuinely escalate in the entire region?
Well, I'm worried, and if someone's not worried, they're not paying attention. It's a real danger, and I think if Israel goes into Gaza big, I think it increases the odds of that happening. It's another argument against their doing so. I think the United States is essentially signaling Tehran, that the U.S. is going to hold Iran accountable. Hezbollah is not an independent actor. It's capable, but it's not independent. The reason you see so many U.S. warships, I think, is to send a message to Tehran. And I can imagine massive sanctions against Iran or against those who would continue to import Iranian oil if Hezbollah enters the war.
Okay, got to leave it there. Richard Haass, thank you very much indeed for that sober assessment.